Why do you keep coming back?" The words came out rougher than William Cooper intended. 4 years of silence crammed into 7 words, aimed at a woman who had done nothing wrong except refuse to disappear. Victoria Harrison didn't flinch. She pressed her worn leather journal against her chest and looked at him with eyes that already knew the answer was going to cost both of them something. She had waited 2 years for him to ask. She had been terrified of the moment he finally did, because the truth, her real reason, wasn't something a man like William Cooper was going to hear easily. If you've ever loved someone who didn't know they needed saving, you already know how this ends. Subscribe. Stay until the last minute, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? Why do you keep coming back? The question came out before William had decided to ask it the way things come out when a man has held them too long and his grip finally gives. He was standing in the emptying church hat in both hands, and Victoria Harrison was 3 feet away with her journal pressed to her chest and her eyes on his face, and for the first time in 2 years of Sundays, he had crossed the aisle and said the thing he'd been not saying since the beginning. She went still. Not startled still. Not caught still. The stillness of someone who had been expecting a moment and was now inside it and had to decide in real time how honest she was willing to be. "To church," she said carefully. "To that pew." He kept his voice level. "Same seat, same time, 2 years. You moved into the Whitfield house and planted a garden and started a project that needed 32 acres. And every Sunday you came in here and sat across an aisle from a man who hadn't said 10 words to anyone in this town since—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I want to know why." The last of the congregation moved past them toward the door. Margaret Albright slowed, almost imperceptibly caught William's expression and decided that her curiosity could be satisfied some other day. The door swung shut behind her. They were alone in the church. Victoria didn't look at the door. She looked at William, and then she sat down. Not because she was unsteady, but with the deliberate calm of someone who understood that this conversation was going to take the time it needed, and she wasn't going to rush it standing up. "Sit down, William." He sat. Not because she'd told him to, because his legs had apparently made the decision independent of his pride. She set the journal on the pew between them and looked at it for a moment before she looked back at him. "I used to know someone like you," she said. "Not in every particular. He wasn't a mountain man, wasn't a cowboy. But he had that same quality of silence, the kind people mistake for coldness, because they don't know the difference between a man who doesn't care and a man who cares so much he can't afford to let any of it out." William watched her face. "How was my father?" she said. "After my mother's first illness, she recovered eventually, but the first time it was very bad. He went somewhere inside himself, and the door closed, and nobody could reach him. Everyone around him gave up. Everyone decided he was lost." Something moved through her expression, not grief exactly, but the specific weight of a memory that has been carried so long, it's changed shape. "Everyone except me." "What did you do?" "I sat with him." She said it simply without decoration. "On Sundays, in our living room. I'd bring whatever I was reading and I'd just be there, not asking him to come back, not trying to fix him, just being in the same room so he'd know the room wasn't empty." The old church settled around them. Outside, a car started in the gravel lot and drove away, and then there was just the wind. "How long?" William asked. 3 years before he really came back." She held his gaze steadily. "Not entirely. People don't come back entirely from something like that. But enough. Enough to laugh sometimes. Enough to say, 'I love you' before I left for college. Enough that the last 6 years I had with him before he died were actually years, not just time passing." She paused. Those years mattered. They only existed because someone stayed. The silence between them had a specific quality, the quality of something being understood, not just heard. "You saw him in me," William said, "the first Sunday I came to this church." No hesitation. No apology. "You were sitting in that pew with your hat in your hands and your eyes on the floor, and you had that same quality. Like a man still fully alive inside who had decided for reasons that were his own, and real and legitimate, that the inside was the only safe place left to be." She looked at him directly. I recognized it. I'd spent 3 years learning to recognize it. William was quiet for a long moment. The truth of what she was telling him was landing in layers, not all at once, but in sequence, each one heavier than the last. This woman had not been watching him. She had not been waiting for him in any romantic or calculated sense. She had been keeping a light on in a window for someone she recognized as lost, because she knew from experience that lost was not the same as gone. "I could have been wrong," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I looked across an aisle at a stranger and made a judgment about his interior life based on a pattern I'd seen once before in one specific person. I could have been entirely wrong about you." "Were you?" She looked at him. "No." He pressed his fist briefly against his sternum, a small private gesture, the same one he'd made the first time he heard her sing. "The journal." He looked at it between them on the pew. "You brought it every Sunday." "I told myself I was reading, writing, having something to do with my hands so I wouldn't look like I was watching you." "Were you watching me?" The corner of her mouth moved. "I was being nearby. There's a difference." He picked up the journal before he'd decided to. She let him. He opened the cover and looked at the first page, her handwriting small and exact, and he didn't read it. He felt the weight of 2 years of Sundays in his hands, and then he closed it and set it back on the pew. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" The question came out with more rawness than he intended. He didn't take it back. "Because you weren't ready." Plain and direct. "And if I'd pushed before you were ready, you'd have been polite about it, and then you'd have been gone. Different pew, different church, different arrangement that kept me at a distance." She paused. "I've seen people push too soon. I watched it happen with my father, well-meaning people who wanted him back on their timeline. Every one of them lost him a little more." She looked at William steadily. "I wasn't willing to risk losing you that way." He sat with that. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves of the old church with a sound like breathing. "That's either the wisest thing I've ever heard," he said, "or the most patient." My father would have said those were the same thing. He looked at her. This woman who had carried a journal into a church for 2 years and sat across an aisle from a broken man and asked for nothing and expected nothing and simply stayed, and something happened in his chest that he had no name for and wasn't going to name today. It was too large, and he was too newly back among the living to handle it with any grace. But he felt it, and he didn't press his fist against his sternum this time. He let it stay. The first time William Cooper noticed Victoria Harrison, he had been sitting in the third pew from the back left side, the same spot he'd occupied every Sunday for 4 years. Far enough from the front that no one expected him to sing. Close enough to the door that he could leave before anyone tried to make conversation. Howe was studying the floor. There was a crack in the wood between his boots that he'd been monitoring for 3 years. A habit that had started as something to look at and had become something closer to meditation when she sat down, not beside him. Nobody sat beside William Cooper anymore. She settled into the pew directly across the aisle 2 seats from the end, and she did it without ceremony. The way people sit when they've already decided they belong somewhere and don't need anyone's permission to confirm it. She set a worn leather journal on the seat beside her and folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead at Reverend Dawson. William looked back at the floor crack. 3 minutes later, he looked up. She wasn't watching him. She was listening to the sermon with the particular quality of attention that most people only performed in church. Genuinely still, genuinely present her lips, moving just slightly on scripture she apparently already knew. Dark hair pinned back without fuss. A blue dress washed past its original color. Hands that had done real work and weren't ashamed of it. He looked back at the floor. He told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. By the following Sunday, he had learned without asking anyone that her name was Victoria Harrison. He had learned this the way he learned most things about the town, by being present and quiet, and letting information arrive naturally, the way water finds its level without being directed. By the Sunday after that, he knew she'd taken the Whitfield house on the eastern edge of town. He knew she'd paid 3 months' rent in cash, which meant she'd come with resources, but not extravagance. He knew she'd bought seeds from Clara at the feed store, vegetable seeds, flower seeds, herb packets, and asked questions that suggested she knew what she was doing. I knew all of this and had said nothing to anyone, and looked at her no more than 4 times per service, and told himself that was nothing. The Sunday that changed the mathematics of it came 5 weeks in. The choir was finishing a hymn, something about rivers, and crossing and coming home. The kind of hymn that worked on a person, whether they wanted it to or not, when he heard her voice for the first time. She wasn't singing for anyone. She was singing the way people sing when the music reaches something they hadn't planned to offer, when the words are true enough that holding them back would feel like a lie. Her voice was low and unpolished, and entirely genuine, and it moved through the hymn like a woman who had earned every word of it. William's chest did something it hadn't done in 4 years. He pressed his fist against his sternum and looked at the Reverend, and did not look at Victoria Harrison again for the rest of the service. He was at his truck before the last amen had finished echoing. His hands on the steering wheel were not steady. He sat there for 3 full minutes before starting the engine, which was 2 minutes and 45 seconds longer than he'd ever needed to start a truck in his life. He drove home. He did not think about her voice. He thought about her voice continuously for 6 days. He needed to understand what grief had cost him, and he needed to understand it honestly because honesty was the only tool he'd ever trusted. Sarah Whitmore had been his. That was the only way he'd ever been able to put it, not as possession, but as alignment. She was his the way the mountain was his, naturally and completely without requiring explanation. They'd grown up side by side, their families' ranches, sharing a fence line, and somewhere between 14 and 17. The friendship between them had quietly reorganized itself into something that neither of them needed to name, because naming it would have made it smaller. They were going to get married. The town understood this the way small towns understand certain things, not through announcement, but through the accumulated weight of years of being seen together at every harvest and every dance and every Sunday service, until nobody thought of them as separate people anymore. She was 26 when the fever took her. 8 days. That was all. The speed of it was the part he'd never been able to reconcile, the idea that something that large could be gone that fast. That 8 days was sufficient time to dismantle a future that had been 20 years in the building. He had not left her side for any of those 8 days. He had been holding her hand when she stopped breathing. He had sat in the chair beside her bed for another 3 hours before anyone was able to move him. That was 4 years ago. The ranch kept running because William was too responsible to let animals suffer for his pain, and too practical to let the land go to ruin. He woke before dawn, worked until dark, ate whatever required the least effort, slept the minimum his body demanded. He had stripped his life to its essential mechanics and removed everything that required another person's investment. The church on Sundays was the one exception he couldn't account for. His mother's voice in his head, maybe. Old habit. He'd stopped trying to explain it. What he could not explain, what kept him awake on the Tuesday after he first heard Victoria Harrison sing, was the fact that grief was supposed to be a wall, and he had built it carefully and maintained it well, and a woman's voice on a hymn about rivers and crossing had found the hairline crack he hadn't known was there. I got up at 2 in the morning, made coffee. He didn't need. Stood at the kitchen counter in the dark and had an honest conversation with himself about what was happening. Nothing was happening, he told himself. He was arriving to church 7 minutes earlier than usual, he told himself back. He went to bed and did not resolve the argument. The second conversation happened at Tom Delaney's hardware store on a Thursday, and it happened by accident, which was the only kind of conversation William was equipped for at that stage. He needed a specific bolt for the north fence. Tom was in the back doing inventory. William got the bolt and turned toward the register and nearly walked directly into Victoria Harrison, who was standing in the narrow aisle, studying a wrench with the concentrated attention of someone who genuinely needed to buy the right one. She looked up, a real surprise not performed. "Mr. Cooper." "Miss Harrison." She held up the wrench slightly. "Pipe under the kitchen sink. I've been putting it off for a month." He looked at the wrench. "That'll work. You want the adjustable grip though, not the fixed. The Whitfield plumbing is all different sizes." She looked at him with the direct attention he was beginning to recognize as her default mode. You know the Whitfield plumbing. I helped Ed Whitfield replace the main line about 6 years ago. Then tell me what I'm in for. She said it without preamble. I'd rather know ahead of time than be surprised when something fails. He almost said he didn't have time. He almost said he needed to get back to the ranch. He almost said any of the several true and available things that would have ended the conversation cleanly. Instead, he said, "The main line is solid. The fixture connections are another matter." She waited. She had a quality of waiting that was unlike most people's. No fidgeting, no filling the silence to cover discomfort. Just actual waiting, as if she had genuine patience for information to arrive. Ed believed plumbing tape solved every problem, William said. It does not solve every problem. Something in her expression shifted dry, precise amusement. That's concerning. The sink'll hold. It's the upstairs bathroom you'll want to watch. The joint under the tub has maybe one more winter before it becomes a real emergency, instead of just a persistent nuisance. She nodded slowly, processing this with the practical focus of someone who managed problems on a limited timeline and wanted accurate information rather than reassurance. That's useful. Thank you, that's specific and honest. You said that before. The words came out before he'd decided to say them. About honesty. I meant it both times. She put the wrench in her basket. I grew up around people who weren't honest. It makes you value the ones who are. He stood in the aisle a beat longer than he'd planned. Where'd you come from before Silver Creek? She looked at him slightly surprised. He thought that he'd asked. Billings originally, then Bozeman for a while, then here. A pause. I was looking for the right place. Did you find it? She held his gaze. I think so. Yes. He went to pay for the bolt. He drove back up the mountain road and spent 40 minutes not analyzing the conversation. He analyzed it the entire way. It was Margaret Albright who pushed him, as Margaret Albright had pushed most things in Silver Creek for 30 years, through the simple expedient of saying the thing nobody else was saying. He came into the post office on a Thursday to mail land assessment paperwork to the county office, and Margaret had lasted approximately 30 seconds before she said, without looking up from the postage scale, "You know Victoria Harrison's been asking about you." He set his envelope down. Waited. She came in Tuesday, mailed some letters I don't know to whom she didn't volunteer, and I didn't ask. Margaret's tone made clear she had very much wanted to ask. She asked how long you'd been attending Sunday services. I told her 4 years. A pause. I may have mentioned Sarah. He was quiet. I didn't say anything inappropriate, Margaret said quickly. She asked if you'd always been that quiet, and I wanted her to understand it wasn't rudeness, it was grief. And she said, Margaret stopped, set down the postage scale with a small definitive click. She said thank you in a way that made me think she already knew. Already knew what? Margaret looked at him the way women of a certain age look at men who are being deliberately obtuse. That you were worth patience, William. I took his receipt and left. He drove the mountain road with those 3 words sitting in the cab of the truck beside him, like a passenger he hadn't invited. Worth patience. He hadn't thought of himself in those terms in 4 years. He hadn't thought of himself as worth anything that required another person's sustained investment. The ranch gate came into view, and he pulled through it and parked and sat in the truck for a while. Then he went inside and made dinner and did not look at the road. The following Sunday, he arrived 12 minutes early. Their first real conversation, the one that mattered, the one that contained things, happened on a Sunday in late October when he crossed the aisle. Not the conversation about the question. That came later. This one happened because he looked at her during the service and knew with the certainty of a man who had spent years reading weather and animals and land that something was wrong. She was sitting in her usual spot, with her usual posture, but the quality of her presence was different. She was there but somewhere else at the same time, and the difference between Victoria fully present and Victoria holding something was a distinction he apparently now knew how to make, which told him more about how closely he'd been paying attention than he was prepared to admit. After the service, he crossed the aisle. She looked up when he stopped beside her, and something moved through her face. Surprise, then a more complicated layer, then a careful return to steadiness. All 3 in about 2 seconds. Are you all right? The question landed somewhere she hadn't prepared for. He could see it, the slight unguardedness of being asked directly by someone who actually wanted to know. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He held it. He was not going to apologize for asking, and he was not going to pretend the question had been casual because it hadn't been. "My brother called last night," she said finally. "Some business with my mother's estate. It's gotten complicated." "Is it the kind of complicated that's better handled alone?" Another look. Longer this time and more honest. "I haven't decided yet." He nodded, stood there for another second. "I'm at the ranch on Wednesday afternoons. If you have a practical problem that needs thinking through, I'm better with those than most other kinds." He paused. "You've got the Whitfield house on your hands and now estate business. That's a lot for one person to carry." She was quiet for a moment. "Why would you offer that?" He thought about answering carefully. He thought about the precise, managed response that would keep a safe distance between the offer and what was underneath it. He looked at her face, the tiredness in it, the careful steadiness, the quality of someone who was used to managing alone, because that was what had been required of her, and decided that careful was the wrong tool here. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "And because I have the time. And because—" He stopped, started again. "Because you've been sitting across an aisle from me for 2 years without asking for anything. The least I can do is be available for a practical conversation." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Wednesday," she said. He walked to his truck. He did not look back. He was 3 miles up the mountain road before he allowed himself to notice that his hands were not entirely steady on the wheel, and that the unsteadiness did not feel like fear. It felt like something waking up. Something that had been very still for a very long time in the dark, waiting without knowing it was waiting for a reason to move again. He drove the rest of the way home with both windows down. The cold air hit his face and he let it, and he did not press his fist against his chest. He just drove and breathed and let the mountain come up around him, and for the first time in 4 years, he arrived at his own gate and felt unmistakably and without permission that he was glad to be alive. I was still carrying something broken, but for the first time in 4 years, he was not entirely sure that broken was the same as finished, and that single uncertain thought followed William Cooper back up the mountain road, like a dog that had decided without being invited to come home with him. I didn't know what to do with hope. That was the honest truth of it. Grief he understood. Grief had a logic. It was the absence of something real, and absence had weight, and weight could be carried. But hope was different. Hope required you to lean forward into something that hadn't happened yet. And the last time William had done that, the thing he'd leaned toward had been taken from him in 8 days. So he did what he always did when something threatened to reorganize him. He went to work. The north fence needed 3 more sections replaced before the first hard freeze, and he had a water line on the east pasture that had been giving him intermittent trouble since August, and there was always something on a working ranch that needed a man's attention more than his own interior life did. He told himself this was practical. He told himself that nothing had changed. He left the tin on the counter. Wednesday came around again, and he did not invite her. He had no practical problem to offer as a justification, and he was not yet ready to admit that justification was not actually required. He worked through Wednesday afternoon and into the evening, and did not check the approach road from the porch. He checked it once, just to see. She wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. He hadn't told her to come, and Victoria Harrison was not the kind of woman who arrived uninvited, and he understood that about her, the same way he understood things about weather and animals, not through analysis, but through the accumulated evidence of paying attention. He went to bed at his usual time and lay awake for an hour longer than usual, and did not think about her voice in the empty church saying, "I know. I noticed. I thought about it constantly." The following Sunday, he got to church 15 minutes early. I was already seated when she came in, and she settled into her pew with her book and her particular quality of presence. And when she glanced across the aisle and found him already watching, neither of them looked away immediately. There was something between them now that hadn't been there before. Not a declaration. Nothing as formal or frightening as that, but an acknowledgement. A mutual recognition that they had both seen something true about the other and had not run from it. The sermon was about second chances. William noticed this with the slight wry discomfort of a man who suspects the universe is making a point at his expense. After the service, she waited for him near the door. He hadn't expected that. He stopped short and then kept walking, and when he reached her, she fell into step beside him in that easy, unpressured way she had, as if walking next to him was simply the most natural thing and required no negotiation. "I have a problem," she said. "Practical. Mostly." A brief pause. "Eleanor Page called me Tuesday." He looked at her. "And she thinks the letters are strong enough to establish intent. She also thinks my brother is going to move faster than we'd anticipated if he finds out I've engaged counsel." She said it evenly, but he heard something underneath it, not fear exactly, but the particular tension of someone calculating time against resources and not liking the numbers. "He's already spoken to a real estate agent in Billings." William stopped walking. They were at the edge of the gravel lot, and the rest of the congregation was trickling past them, and he turned to look at her fully. "How much time does Eleanor think you have?" 3 weeks, maybe 4 if he gets impatient and makes a mistake." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not asking you to fix this, William. Eleanor's handling the legal angle. I wanted to tell you because you're the one who pointed me toward her." "What else?" he said. She looked at him. "What? There's something else. You wouldn't have waited by the door to tell me something Eleanor's handling." A pause. Something shifted in her expression. Not discomfort exactly, but the look of someone recalculating. "The real estate agent my brother spoke to," she said carefully. "His name is Caldwell. Nathan Caldwell." The name landed in William's chest with a specific, unpleasant weight. "Nathan Caldwell, senior or junior?" "Junior, I think." He introduced himself as Nathan. "He's not a real estate agent," William said. "He's a developer. He buys land through agents, so his name doesn't appear until the deal is closed." Victoria was very still. "How do you know that?" "Because he made an offer on the property east of mine 2 years ago, and I spent 3 weeks finding out everything I could about him before I told him no." He looked at her steadily. "He doesn't buy land for what it's worth, Victoria. He buys it for what it'll be worth after he controls the water access to everything around it." The silence between them was sharp and immediate. "My mother's 32 acres, she said slowly. "They back up against the Miller Creek tributary." "I know. And Miller Creek feeds half the valley, yes." She absorbed this for a moment. He watched her do it, watched her move from surprise through anger to something colder and more focused. The particular quality of a woman who had grown up managing difficult situations and knew that useful emotion was controlled emotion. "My brother doesn't know that," she said. "He just sees the sale price Caldwell offered. Caldwell is counting on that." She looked at him directly. "What would you do?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'd talk to my brother first, before anything else. He needs to understand what he's actually selling before he decides to sell it. He doesn't listen to me. He thinks I'm sentimental about the land because of our mother." "Are you?" "Yes." No hesitation. "But I'm also correct, and those aren't mutually exclusive." The corner of William's mouth moved, just barely. He caught it before it became anything identifiable and looked back toward the road. "Let me make a call this week," he said. "There's a man at the county assessor's office who tracked some of Caldwell's previous acquisitions. What he found was interesting." She watched him. "Why would you do that?" The question was direct and deserved a direct answer. He gave it the only honest one he had. "Because it's the right thing to do." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she nodded once. "All right." He drove back up the mountain road, and this time he did not examine the feeling in his chest too closely, because he already knew what it was and wasn't ready for what knowing it meant. The call to the county assessor's office took 20 minutes and confirmed what William had already suspected. Nathan Caldwell Jr. had acquired 7 parcels in the valley over the past 4 years, each one bordering a tributary or a natural water source. Each one purchased through a different agent for a price slightly above market value. generous enough to seem fair, strategic enough to make the seller feel good about the transaction before they understood what they'd given away. The map of those 7 parcels told a story that the individual transactions didn't. Together they formed a chain that, with the addition of one more specific piece of land, 32 acres in the southern foothills, backing up against Miller Creek, would give Nathan Caldwell effective control over the water access to 60% of the farmable land in the Silver Creek Valley. William sat with that map for a long time. Then he drove down to the Whitfield house. He knocked. She answered quickly, as if she'd been moving around inside rather than sitting still, which matched what he was coming to understand about how she occupied spaces actively, practically never wasting time. "I need to show you something," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in, set the papers on her kitchen table, the assessor's records, the map he'd pieced together from the parcel descriptions, and let her look. She was silent for a long time. "He's been doing this for 4 years, she said finally, systematically. "And nobody noticed?" "Nobody looked at all of them at once." He pulled a chair out from the table, turned it backward, sat on it, with his forearms on the top rail. "Individual transactions look like ordinary land deals. It's only when you put them on a map that the pattern shows up." She straightened, turned to look at him. "My brother needs to see this." "Yes. He's going to be angry that I had it investigated, probably. He's going to say I'm making it about the community project. Is he wrong?" She met his eyes. "No, but I'm also not wrong about the water access." "Tell him both things," William said. "Tell him you're sentimental about the land, and you're also correct. Don't let him make you choose between those." Something in her face shifted, a small surprised quality, as if he had said something she didn't expect. "You're very good at this," she said quietly, "for someone who doesn't talk to people." He stood up from the chair. "I talk to people. I just don't do it unless I have something worth saying." That almost smile again. He was starting to recognize it as the real one, the one she didn't perform, the one that arrived before she could decide whether to allow it. "I'll call Daniel tonight," she said. Daniel was the brother's name. He stored it automatically the way he stored practical information. "Can I tell him where this came from?" "Tell him it came from the county assessor's public records," which it did. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. "If he wants to look me in the eye about it, he knows where I live." He was almost to the door when she said, "William." He stopped, turned. "Thank you." She said it differently this time, not the easy habitual thank you of someone raised to be courteous, but something more deliberate, specific. "I mean it. You didn't have to do any of this." He held the door handle for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't." He let that sit. Then he left. Daniel Harrison arrived in Silver Creek on a Thursday. William knew this because Victoria appeared at his gate at 8 in the morning. Not at his door, at his gate, standing beside a truck he didn't recognize, and looking like a woman who had spent a night being argued at and was still standing straight because she had decided to be. He went out to meet her. He came, she said. He looked at everything. He spent 2 hours on the phone with a contact of his in Billings. She looked tired in the way of someone who was tired all the way through, not just at the surface. He believes the water access documentation. He's not sure it's enough to override the sale. What does he want? He wants the money, William. He has real debt. His wife's medical bills from last year. It was a bad year for them. She said it without judgment, which he noted. He's not a bad person. He just needs the problem solved, and Caldwell's offer solves it. How much is the offer? She told him. William was quiet for a moment. The number was generous in the precise, calculated way Caldwell's offers always were. Has he spoken to Eleanor Page? I asked him to. He said he would. She paused. He also said something about you. William waited. He asked who you were, why you were involved. She met his eyes steadily. I told him you were a neighbor who'd been helping me understand the land situation. He said... She stopped, started again. He said he didn't think I needed a cowboy to tell me how land law worked. The words landed flatly between them. He watched her face as she said it, and he could see that she was watching his, and he understood that she was telling him this directly because she believed he deserved directness, even when the directness was uncomfortable. "That's fair," he said. "It isn't actually. He doesn't know me." "No," she straightened. "But I do, and I told him so." Something about the simplicity of that, the plain, unelaborated fact of it, hit him somewhere beneath his ribs with an accuracy that made him need to look away for a moment. He looked at the fence line, looked back. "I'd like to meet him," he said. "Are you sure, Key?" "Yes." "He's not easy." "I'm not easy either." He held her gaze. "Set it up." The meeting happened at the Whitfield house that afternoon. Daniel Harrison was several years older than his sister and looked like a man who had recently been through something difficult and was compensating with a kind of bristling efficiency. Sharp questions, short sentences, the body language of someone who had decided ahead of time what he was going to think. He looked at William, the way men sometimes look at other men when they're trying to establish whether there's a threat and what kind. William looked back without inflection and offered his hand. Daniel took it. "My sister says you've been helping her," Daniel said. "I've been sharing information, yeah." "What's your interest in this land?" "None directly. It borders some ranches I know, and Nathan Caldwell tried to buy a property adjacent to mine 2 years ago." Daniel was quiet for a beat. "How'd that end?" "I said no." "He accept that?" "Mostly." William let that sit. He moved on to easier targets. Daniel looked at him sharply. "Are you calling my mother's land an easy target?" "I'm calling an estate in probate without a clear will and a seller who needs the money a target." "Yeah." He said it straight. "That's not a criticism of your situation. That's a description of how Caldwell operates. He looks for circumstances where a person has limited options and real need. He's very patient and very strategic, and by the time most people understand what they've agreed to, the deal is closed." Daniel sat with that. He was quiet for longer than William expected, which moved him up slightly in William's estimation. "If I don't sell," Daniel said finally, "I still have the debt." "Eleanor Page talked to you?" "This morning." "What did she say about the letters?" "She thinks there's a case for establishing our mother's intent as a legal directive rather than a moral one." He glanced at his sister, then back at William. "She also mentioned something about a quiet title action and a possible filing that might freeze the sale pending review." "That buys time." "Time doesn't pay bills." "No," William agreed. "But it keeps you from making a permanent decision under temporary pressure." Daniel was quiet again. He picked up the map William had put together, the 7 parcels, the water chain, and looked at it with the focus of someone who was actually seeing it now, rather than deciding ahead of time how to dismiss it. "If Caldwell controls this," he said, pointing to where Miller Creek connected the parcels, "what happens to the farms downstream? They pay whatever he charges for access, or they sell. He'd have leverage over the whole valley." "That's the plan." Daniel set the map down. He looked at his sister. She looked back at him with the patient, steady quality that William was starting to understand was just how she held herself in difficult situations, not detached, but controlled enough to stay useful. "I need to make some calls," Daniel said. "Take the time you need," William said. "Why do you care?" Daniel looked at him directly. "I mean that honestly. You don't know us. You're not connected to this land. Why are you spending your time on this?" William met his gaze, thought about the honest answer, gave it. "Because someone I respect is trying to build something worth building, and a man with too much money is trying to stop her for reasons that have nothing to do with what the land is worth and everything to do with what it can control." He paused. "And because I spent 4 years convincing myself that what happened in this valley wasn't my business. I'm done with that." Daniel held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the map. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. That night, after Daniel had gone to the motel on the far end of Main Street, Victoria, and William sat on the porch of the Whitfield house in the cold autumn air, and she told him about the community project in the detail she hadn't had occasion to share before. It wasn't just a garden. It was a teaching space, practical agriculture, food preservation, basic land stewardship. All the knowledge that had been leaving rural communities for decades as young people moved to cities and the old ways became no one's inheritance. She had a plan for 3 covered growing spaces, an outdoor classroom, a small library of agricultural texts, and enough kitchen space to teach food preparation alongside the growing. She had sketches. She had supplier contacts. She had a list of 17 families in the valley who had already said they'd participate. She had been building this for 3 years quietly, without making a production of it, the way she did everything. He listened to all of it. "Your mother knew about it," he said. "It was her idea originally." A pause. "She couldn't do it herself. Her health by the end didn't allow it. But she wanted the land used this way. She said if land doesn't feed people, it's just geography." He sat with that. "Your brother doesn't know about the 17 families." "No. Tell him tomorrow. Show him the list." He looked at the dark tree line at the edge of the property. "He's not a bad person like you said. He's a person who doesn't have enough of the picture. Give him the picture." She was quiet for a moment. "You're doing it again." "What?" "Being better at this than you think you are." He was still for a beat. "I'm just practical. People who are just practical don't sit on someone's porch at 9 o'clock at night to help them think through their brother's reluctance." He looked at her. She looked back. The cold air moved between them. Somewhere below the property, a creek was running, probably Miller Creek, he thought, carrying the water that someone was trying to own. "Victoria," he said. "Don't apologize for being here," she said quietly. "It's not something you need to apologize for." He closed his mouth. Then after a moment, "How do you know that's what I was going to say?" "Because you've been sitting very straight for the last 10 minutes, which is what you do when you're about to say something you think might be unwelcome." He stared at her. "You've been studying me. You've been studying me for 1.5 years from across a church aisle. We're even." He laughed. He hadn't expected it. It came out of him without warning. A short, surprised sound, genuinely funny to him, genuinely unexpected, the kind of laugh that can't be managed or shaped or held at arm's length. He heard it, and for a second it sounded foreign, like a word in a language he'd used to speak fluently and had not spoken in a long time. Victoria was smiling. Not the corner of the mouth almost smile, the real one. "There he is," she said softly. Not triumphant, not pointed. Just present, as if she was naming something that had always been there waiting to be seen. He stopped laughing. But something in him did not close back up the way he'd expected it to. He stayed on the porch for another hour. They talked about practical things: the fence on the north side of her property that needed attention before winter, the soil composition in the lower acreage, and what it would support the best supplier for the glazed panels she'd need for the covered growing spaces. Practical, specific, entirely manageable things. But underneath the practical conversation, something else was happening that neither of them named, because naming it would have changed the weight of it, and neither of them wanted that yet. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to his truck. The stars were hard and clear in the cold sky, the kind of night that reminded you that you were very small in a very large world, and that this was not necessarily a frightening thing. "Daniel will come around," he said. "Give him the picture." "I will." She folded her arms against the cold. "William, what you said in there, about being done with convincing yourself that what happened in the valley wasn't your business." He looked at her. "Was that about Caldwell?" she asked. "Or was it about something else?" A long moment. Honest enough to deserve an honest answer. "Both," he said. She held his gaze and nodded once slowly, as if that was the answer she'd expected, and it meant more to her than a longer one would have. He got in his truck. Drove the first mile up the mountain road in a silence that felt different from all the other silences he'd lived inside. Not empty, not armored. Just open. Which was, he was beginning to understand, the most frightening and necessary thing a silence could be. Daniel called Victoria the following morning. The answer was not the one either of them expected, and when she called William to tell him what her brother had said, he was already on his way back down the mountain, because Part 3, Nathan Caldwell had been in town since Tuesday, And 3 people had called William in the past 2 hours to tell him that Caldwell had started asking questions. Specific questions about William Cooper, about Victoria Harrison, and about exactly what the two of them had been doing with a county assessor's map and a retired estate lawyer from Missoula, which meant that someone had been watching and watching closely, and William had underestimated how fast Caldwell moved when he felt a deal slipping. He was already pulling through the gate of the Whitfield property when his phone rang again. Victoria's number. He answered before the second ring. "I know. Where are you?" "Inside. Daniel's here." A pause, tight controlled. "Nathan Caldwell came to the house this morning, William, an hour ago. He knocked on my door." William stopped the truck. "He came to your house. I was very polite about it." The dryness in her voice was the kind that comes from keeping something much sharper underneath very tight control. "He said he'd heard I had concerns about the sale, and he wanted to address them personally. He brought coffee from the diner." "What did you say to him?" "I didn't let him in." A beat. "He left his card. Said he hoped we could talk before things became complicated." William turned off the engine. "Before things became complicated." His exact words. "He's establishing a paper trail," William said, "showing he made good faith contact before any dispute went formal. It's what he does." He was already out of the truck and moving toward the door. "I'm at your gate. Come let me in." She opened the door before he reached it. She looked like someone who had spent the morning being reasonable in the face of something that did not deserve reasonableness, composed on the surface, but with a quality of tension around her jaw that he was learning to read as the sign of how much effort that composure was actually costing her. Daniel Harrison was at the kitchen table. He stood when William came in, a quick automatic courtesy from a man who'd been raised to it, and they looked at each other across the room with the frank mutual assessment of two people who had heard things about each other and were now deciding what to do with what they saw directly. "You're Cooper," Daniel said. "Yes. Caldwell knows who you are." Daniel pushed the business card across the table without picking it up. "He mentioned you by name when he was at the door. Said he hoped any concerns Mr. Cooper had raised were based on complete information." William looked at the card. He didn't touch it. "He's drawing me into it. If I'm named in a dispute, he can argue I have a personal vendetta from the previous offer on my neighbor's property. It muddies the water." Victoria was watching him from across the kitchen. "Can he do that?" "He can try." William looked at Daniel. "What were you going to call Victoria about this morning before all this?" Daniel crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, a man physically working through a decision. I was going to tell her I'd take 2 more weeks before signing anything." He glanced at his sister. "The list you gave me last night, the 17 families." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "My mother knew about all of them." "She knew most of them personally," Victoria said quietly. A long pause from Daniel that carried the particular weight of a man revising something fundamental about the story he'd been telling himself. "She never told me." "She didn't want you to feel pressured. She thought you had enough." Daniel pulled out the chair and sat back down heavily. Not dramatically, just the physical expression of something internal landing. "All right." He pressed both hands flat on the table. "What do we do?" What they did that afternoon was everything Eleanor Page told them to do, and nothing more. Eleanor drove up from her house on the far side of town in a truck older than most of the furniture in William's ranch house, and she came in with a legal pad and a reading glasses case, and the particular manner of a woman who had spent 30 years in courtrooms and had long since stopped being impressed by men with money and business cards. She looked at Caldwell's card on the table. "He came here himself." "This morning," Victoria said. "Good." Eleanor sat down. "That's a mistake on his part. Direct contact before a formal proceeding opens him up to characterization later." She uncapped her pen. "Now, Daniel, walk me through the debt structure and what timeline we're actually working with." William sat back against the wall and listened. This was what he was good at, listening to everything, finding the shape of the problem underneath the language people used to describe it. Eleanor was methodical and specific, and did not waste words, which meant that within 40 minutes she had established a picture of Daniel's situation that was more complete than Daniel had apparently given anyone before, including himself. The medical debt was real and substantial. The timeline pressure was also real, not because Caldwell was forcing it, but because two of the creditors had sent second notices in September, and a third was approaching the threshold for collections action. Daniel had not told Victoria any of this. He'd only told her he needed the money. Victoria sat very still while Eleanor laid this out. She did not look at her brother with anything that could be called accusation. She looked at her hands. When Eleanor finished, the room was quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" Victoria said. Not to Eleanor, to Daniel. "Because you've had enough on your plate." He was looking at the table. "You've been building this project for 3 years, on nothing but your own savings and your own time, and I didn't want to add my mess to your load." "Daniel, I know." He looked up. "I know it would have changed things. I know I should have." He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man who was done managing how he appeared and was just being tired. "I'm sorry, Vic." The use of the nickname was the most human thing William had heard from him, and it apparently hit Victoria the same way, because something in her face softened in a way that made William look at the wall for a moment, out of the sense that some things deserved privacy. Eleanor let the moment exist. Then, "Here's what we can do. A quiet title action gives us the freeze on the sale. It won't be quick, but it will be legal, and it will hold." She looked at Daniel. "On the debt, there are options we haven't explored yet. Two of those creditors are medical facilities. Medical debt has specific negotiation pathways that most people don't know about because the facilities don't volunteer the information." Daniel looked up. "Such as income-based hardship deferral on 2 of the 3, possibly a structured settlement on the 3rd that extends your timeline by 18 months. She wrote something on the legal pad. "I have a contact in the hospital system who handles exactly this. It's not forgiveness, but it removes the immediate pressure." The silence in the kitchen shifted quality. It went from tight to careful, the silence of people recalculating. "If the pressure is off," Daniel said slowly, "I don't need the quick sale." "Correct. And if I don't need the quick sale, then Caldwell's leverage disappears," William said from the wall, "because his leverage was never about the land. It was about your deadline." Daniel turned to look at him. A long look, not hostile now, something more honest than that. "You figured that out before today," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. "When Victoria told me about the debt situation, not the specifics, she didn't know those, but the shape of it. And you didn't tell me directly." "It wasn't mine to tell." William met his eyes. "It was hers when you were ready." Daniel held his gaze for another moment. Then he looked at his sister. "You found a good one," he said quietly. Victoria's expression did something complicated. She started to speak, and then didn't, and William was grateful because he didn't have a ready answer to what Daniel had just said, and was not prepared to find one in a room with 3 other people. Eleanor tapped her legal pad. "I need the letters from your mother, all of them. And I need Daniel's signature on a document authorizing me to represent the estate on your behalf, both of you jointly. Can we do that today?" "Yes," they said in near unison. Eleanor looked mildly satisfied in the way of someone who has spent a career solving problems that other people decided were unsolvable. "Then let's get to work." The filing went in on a Friday. William knew because Eleanor called him, not Victoria, him at 7 in the morning before he'd finished his first cup of coffee, to tell him that the quiet title action had been logged, and that she had also filed a formal objection to the pending sale based on the letters establishing testamentary intent. "Why are you calling me?" he asked. "Because you'll know what to do with the information, and Victoria is currently on the phone with her brother." A pause that had nothing particularly elderly or deferential about it. "Also because Caldwell has retained a lawyer from Billings. A real one, not a facilitator. Name's Harlan Moore. I've gone against Moore twice. He's smart, and he plays long games." "How long?" "Long enough that if we give him any procedural openings, he'll string this out until Daniel's debt crisis reasserts itself and the pressure comes back." Another pause. "Which means we don't give him any openings." "What do you need from me?" "Nothing legal. But Caldwell is going to move socially before he moves legally. That's his pattern. He'll start making noise in town, at the diner, at the church, wherever people listen. He'll frame it as a reasonable businessman being obstructed by outsiders. William set down his coffee cup. He'll make it about me. He already has. Tom Delaney called me last night. Apparently Caldwell had dinner at the diner on Thursday, and mentioned very casually that he was concerned about the influence some people in the valley were having on a grieving family's land decisions. The precision of Eleanor's diction made the contempt in it especially clear. He used the word influence 3 times. Tom counted. The line between calculated and deliberate was very thin, and Nathan Caldwell walked it expertly. He wants me reactive, William said. If I push back publicly, he frames it as a personal dispute and muddies the water rights issue. Exactly. And if I stay quiet, the narrative sets without resistance. William looked at this window. The mountain was doing what it always did. Sitting there, indifferent, magnificently unhurried. He thought about 4 years of staying quiet, and everything that had cost. He thought about Victoria saying some people don't need someone to fix them. They just need someone who believes they are worth finding, and the fact that she had been talking about her father and he had hurt himself in it anyway. Tell Tom Delaney, he said, that if anyone wants to know what's actually in those county assessor's records, I'll be at the hardware store Saturday morning, and I'm not hard to find. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. You're going to let people ask you directly. I'm going to be available to answer honest questions. That's different from making a speech. She sounded like someone filing something away. All right. And William, don't go looking for Caldwell. Let him come to you if he wants. I'm not looking for anyone, he said. I'm just done staying on the mountain. Saturday morning, the hardware store. Tom Delaney had mentioned William's name to exactly the right number of people, which was everyone who came in for anything between Thursday evening and Saturday noon. By the time William arrived at 10, there were 7 men in the store who were all pretending to need something from different sections and were actually waiting to have a conversation about Nathan Caldwell. William recognized what was happening immediately. He set down the hinge, said he'd come for legitimately, and gave the room a moment to stop pretending. Hector Ramos, who ran the largest produce farm in the Southern Valley, and whose water access ran directly through the Miller Creek tributary, spoke first. He was a blunt, hard-working man in his 60s who had never had patience for anything indirect. Is it true what Eleanor Page filed that Caldwell's been buying water access? It's true that the parcels he's acquired form a chain that connects to the Miller Creek tributary, William said. Whether that was his intention from the beginning or a consequence of opportunistic buying, I can't say for certain. The pattern suggests intention. My farm is on Miller Creek, Ramos said. I know. If he controls the upstream access, he controls your negotiating position on everything involving water. Yes. Ramos said something in Spanish that William didn't speak well enough to translate precisely, but understood clearly enough from context. The 2 men beside him, both of whom farmed the eastern corridor, were very still. Ed Pearson, who ran the co-op grain elevator and was the kind of man who preferred to understand a problem completely before reacting to it, held up a hand. How solid is the evidence? The assessor records are, they clear enough to hold up if this goes to dispute. Eleanor Page filed on Friday, William said. She reviewed everything before filing. Eleanor doesn't file on uncertain ground. A murmur through the room. Eleanor's reputation in Silver Creek was the specific kind that required no elaboration. What can we do? Ramos asked. Show up. William picked up his hinges. Eleanor's filing is on public record. If the people most affected by Caldwell's land chain make themselves visible as interested parties, it changes the character of the dispute from a family estate matter to a valley-wide water rights concern. That's harder to steamroll. You want us to file something? Pearson asked. I want you to talk to Eleanor Page. She'll tell you what's useful and what's not. I'm not a lawyer, and this isn't my property. He looked around the room steadily. But I live in this valley, and I use the same water you do, and I'm done waiting to see how things turn out. He paid for the hinges and left. He was in his truck, not yet moving, when the knock came on the passenger window. He reached over and unlocked the door. Tom Delaney climbed in slightly out of breath and shut the door. "Caldwell is at the diner right now," Tom said. "I know. He's having breakfast with Reverend Dawson." William went still. Dawson. He's been a member of the church for 6 months. Nobody thought much of it because he tithes well and keeps to himself. Tom's expression said exactly what he thought of this in retrospect. "Margaret Albright saw them come in together this morning and called me immediately." William processed this for a moment. Nathan Caldwell having breakfast with the man who led the Sunday services that Victoria had been attending for 2 years was either a coincidence or it was not. And William had spent enough time understanding Caldwell's operational method to know that Caldwell did not do coincidences. "What does Dawson know about the filing?" William said. "I don't know, but he had lunch with Margaret on Wednesday." Tom let the implication sit. "And Margaret knows everything," which meant Caldwell, through Dawson, might know considerably more than he should have known this quickly. William ran the timeline back through his head. Caldwell had shown up at Victoria's door the morning before Eleanor filed. He'd been asking questions about William before that. The sequence didn't feel like improvisation. It felt like someone had been feeding him information. "Has Caldwell been to Sunday services?" William asked. Tom thought. 3 or 4 times, back in September, I think, and once in October. September was when Victoria had called Eleanor Page for the first time. October was when William had gone to the county assessor's office. "Tom," William said carefully, "I need you to think back. After that first Sunday Caldwell came to services, did anything change about how Reverend Dawson talked to Victoria? Anything small? Even something that seemed like nothing at the time?" Tom was quiet. He was a man who paid attention to things, which was why William was asking him. "He started coming over to speak to her after the service," Tom said slowly. "Checking in on her, asking about how she was settling into the Whitfield house." A pause. "I thought he was just being pastoral." "Maybe he was," William said. "Or maybe he was reporting what she said." Tom's face went through something that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite confirmation. "Lord, don't say anything yet." William started the truck. "Don't say anything to anyone until I've talked to Victoria." "What are you going to do?" "Find out what Caldwell actually knows." He put the truck in gear. "And how long he's known it." Victoria already understood something was wrong when he arrived. She opened the door before he knocked. She'd seen the truck coming up the road, and her expression told him she'd been doing her own thinking since Eleanor's call that morning. "Come in," she said. "Daniel's on the phone with the hospital contact Eleanor mentioned. He'll be a while." They went to the kitchen. He told her about the diner, about Dawson, about the timeline. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment with her hands flat on the table in front of her, the same posture Eleanor used when she was organizing information, and he noted the similarity without mentioning it. "Dawson asked me in October whether I had any legal support for the estate situation," she said. "I told him I was looking into it. I didn't say Eleanor's name." A pause. "But I told him I'd gotten some help from a neighbor who knew the county records. I didn't say your name either." "He would have told Caldwell a neighbor was helping you. Caldwell would have had his people look at who your neighbors were. He found you, and my history with the previous offer." William looked at her steadily. "Victoria, how much does Dawson know about the community project? The specific plans?" She went very still. "I spoke about it in his office, about a month after I arrived. I was asking about whether the church had any interest in partnering on the educational component." She met his eyes. He was warm about it, encouraging. He said it sounded like exactly the kind of thing Silver Creek needed, the cold, clean precision of a thing you'd rather not see clearly. "He's been feeding Caldwell information since the beginning," William said. "Not the legal details, he probably doesn't have those, but the general shape of what you're building, why the land matters, how committed you are to it." He paused. "Caldwell needed to know whether you'd actually fight for it, or whether the project was soft enough to collapse under pressure. And now he knows I'll fight." Her voice was steady. "So he shifted tactics. He came to the house. He started working socially." She paused. He's trying to make me look like a problem rather than a person with a legitimate claim. Yes. She stood up, walked to the counter, turned back. I need to talk to Reverend Dawson. Victoria. Not angrily, not with accusations. Her eyes were clear and completely decided. He may not fully understand what Caldwell is doing with what he shared. He may think he was being helpful mentioning a church member's project to a generous donor. Something moved through her expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pity, but contained elements of both. Or he may know exactly what he's doing. Either way, I need to look him in the face and find out. That could tip Caldwell that we've connected the chain. It will definitely tip Caldwell that we've connected the chain, she said. But if Dawson is going to keep talking to him, I'd rather that conversation happen on my terms. She looked at William steadily. Come with me. To the church. To the church. He stood up from the table. You know this changes things. I know. She picked up her jacket. I've been sitting across an aisle from things that needed to be faced for most of my life, William. I'm better at walking toward them. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had waited 2 years without agenda and now moved without hesitation. And the thing in his chest that he'd been managing carefully for weeks pushed against his careful management with a force that took him a beat to absorb. Let's go, he said. Reverend Dawson was in his office when they arrived, which surprised him visibly. He was a man in his early 60s practiced at warmth, the kind of warmth that was genuine often enough that the times it wasn't were difficult to distinguish until you had cause to look carefully. He had cause now. He stood when they came in. Victoria did not sit down. I need to ask you something directly, she said. I'd appreciate a direct answer. Dawson looked between them. Something moved in his expression. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who has been anticipating a question and is now calculating whether denial is still plausible. Of course, he said. How long have you known Nathan Caldwell? A pause that lasted 1 second too long. He's been a member of the church since... I'm not asking when he joined the church. Victoria's voice was perfectly even. I'm asking how long you've known him personally. Another pause. Dawson looked at his desk, then back at her. We met through a charitable foundation 2 years ago. He's been generous to several of the church's outreach programs. And in the course of your friendship, Victoria said, did you share with him what I told you about my mother's land and the community project I was planning for it? The silence this time was different. Conclusive. Victoria, Dawson started. Yes or no? William was standing behind her and slightly to her right, and he watched Dawson's face do the specific thing that faces do when a person is making the final calculation between the story they've been telling themselves and the truth they've been avoiding. I mentioned your project, Dawson said finally. I thought he might want to contribute. His foundation supports community agricultural initiatives. I thought it was a natural fit. He straightened in his chair. I didn't know he was involved in the land sale. I didn't know he had any connection to your family's estate. Did you tell him my neighbor was helping me with the county records? A beat. I may have mentioned that you'd gotten some local support. And when he asked you who that neighbor was, what did you tell him? The silence that followed had the quality of a man arriving somewhere he hadn't meant to go. I told him I thought it was William Cooper, Dawson said quietly. I'd seen you talking after services. Victoria let that sit in the room for a moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not look away from him. I want you to understand something, she said finally. I'm not going to tell you what kind of man Nathan Caldwell is, because I think on some level you already know. But I want you to understand that what you told him has been used to target me, to target my brother's financial vulnerabilities, and to position a challenge to a water access situation that affects nearly every farm in this valley. She paused. I am not asking you to take sides in a legal dispute. I am asking you as your church member to stop sharing information about me with a man whose business model depends on that information. Dawson's face had gone through several things during this speech and arrived at something that looked genuinely like shame. Not the performed kind, but the specific kind that comes from seeing your own actions from the outside for the first time. I didn't intend for any of this, he said. I know. Her voice was not without compassion, but it was without softness. Intentions aren't the whole of it. She turned and walked out. William held Dawson's gaze for one more second, not threatening, not triumphant, just steady and clear, and then followed her. Outside, she walked to his truck and stopped. Her hands were shaking very slightly. He noticed because he was paying attention to everything about her and could not stop. Victoria, I'm all right. She pressed her palms flat against the truck door, a brief grounding pressure. I trusted him. I talked to him about my mother. I talked to him about what the land meant to her. I know. And he took that and handed it to a man who was planning to use it. Yes, she turned to look at him. There was something raw in her face that she wasn't trying to control, which told him how much the betrayal had cost her, and seeing it did something to him that rearranged the furniture in his chest permanently. I need 5 minutes, she said. Take 10. She looked at him. Then, without apparent calculation, she put her hand on his arm, not clutching, not dramatic, just present. Her hand on his arm in the cold morning air, steadying herself against something real, instead of standing alone in it. He covered her hand with his. Just once, just briefly. She straightened, took a breath. All right. She pulled back. We need to call Eleanor. Yes, and we need to figure out what Caldwell actually knows versus what he suspects, because those are different problems. Yes. He was still looking at her. You did well in there. I didn't feel well in there. That's not the same thing. He opened the truck door. The people who are actually brave are the ones who are frightened and do it anyway. The ones who aren't frightened aren't being brave. They're just not paying attention. She looked at him for a moment. This woman who had sat 2 years in a church pew, paying attention to a man who couldn't see past his own grief, who had waited without agenda and moved without hesitation and been betrayed by someone she trusted and kept standing up anyway. Get in the truck, William, she said. He got in the truck. She pulled out her phone and called Eleanor before he'd finished starting the engine, and her voice was crisp and specific and entirely steady. And while she was talking, William drove back toward the main road and allowed himself to acknowledge quietly and without ceremony that he was no longer in any doubt about what was happening to him. How was falling in love with Victoria Harrison, and Nathan Caldwell had just made the tactical error of making it personal, because a man protecting something he cared about was an entirely different animal than a man simply defending his territory. And within 48 hours of that realization, Caldwell demonstrated that he understood this too, because he stopped being careful. The first sign came Monday morning. Margaret Albright called Victoria at 7:15. Not to gossip, Margaret had apparently made a private reckoning with herself over the weekend about what her information sharing had cost the people she actually liked, but to warn her. Caldwell's lawyer, Harlan Moore, had filed a counter-motion to Eleanor's quiet title action. The filing characterized Victoria's claim on the property as financially motivated interference with a legitimate estate sale, and it named William Cooper as an interested party with a documented history of obstructing Caldwell's business operations in the valley. Victoria called William while Margaret was still talking. He answered on the first ring. I know. Eleanor just called me. He named you in the filing. He named me in the filing. A pause. Are you angry? He thought about it honestly. No, I'm clarified. He was already moving toward his truck. Being named means he's worried. If he wasn't worried, he'd ignore me entirely. Eleanor says the characterization won't hold. There's no legal basis for framing you as an obstructionist when all you did was access public records. Eleanor's right, but that's not why he did it. He started the engine. He did it to make me feel exposed, to see if I'll pull back. Will you? The question was direct and deserved directness. No, he said. Are you at the house? Yes, Daniel's here. He's... A brief pause. He's angry, William. Really angry. He called Caldwell's offer line this morning and told them the sale was no longer under consideration. He wasn't polite about it. Something shifted in William's chest. A loosening, a small release of something he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the first time he'd sat across a table from Daniel Harrison and felt the resistance in the man like a wall. Good, he said. He also called 3 of his creditors himself, without waiting for Eleanor's contact. Her voice carried something warm underneath the tension. He apparently told the hospital billing department that he was aware of the hardship deferral program, and he'd like to speak to someone with actual authority. They put him through in 10 minutes. He's his mother's son, after all. A beat of silence. Then quietly, "Yes, he is." "I'm on my way down," William said. "Don't let Daniel do anything else before I get there." "I'll try. I make no promises about my brother when he has momentum." He drove the mountain road faster than usual. Daniel Harrison in motion was a different person than Daniel Harrison at a kitchen table calculating debt against deadline. He had the quality of a man who had spent months in a defensive crouch and had finally straightened up, and the relief of standing straight again had translated directly into action. By the time William arrived, Daniel had already spoken to 2 of the 3 creditors, drafted a letter to the 3rd, outlining his intention to engage their hardship process, and called Eleanor Page to tell her that his debt timeline was longer than he'd initially represented, and he wanted to know if that changed the legal landscape. It did. It changed it considerably. Eleanor arrived 30 minutes after William, driving her ancient truck with the same unhurried authority she brought to everything, and she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the 4 documents Daniel had already produced and said without preamble, "You should have told me all of this 2 weeks ago." "I know," Daniel said. "It would have saved us a filing and accelerated the counter considerably." "I know that too." Eleanor looked at him over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who has decided that reproach is less useful than momentum. "All right. Moore's counter-motion changes our approach. He's trying to reframe this as a personal dispute rather than an estate matter, which means we need to make the water rights issue the center of the conversation before he can establish the personal dispute narrative as the primary frame." "How?" Victoria asked. "We make it public." Eleanor set down her legal pad. "Formally public. I've been in contact with 2 of the other Valley landowners whose parcels border Caldwell's chain, Ramos and Pearson. They're prepared to file as interested parties in the water rights dimension of this dispute. If they do that, Moore's framing collapses because you cannot characterize a valley-wide water access concern as a personal vendetta." William looked at Eleanor. "When did you contact Ramos and Pearson?" "Saturday afternoon, after Tom Delaney told me about your conversation at the hardware store." She had the slight air of someone who had been managing a slightly larger operation than anyone had realized. "I've been practicing law for 30 years. I know how to work on multiple fronts." Victoria was watching Eleanor with an expression that contained both admiration and a trace of something protective. The look of someone who has just understood that an older woman has been quietly carrying more than anyone gave her credit for. "Eleanor," she said, "are you doing this because it's a good case, or because you care about what happens to this valley?" Eleanor looked at her over the reading glasses for a moment. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. "I've lived here for 40 years. Nathan Caldwell is not the first man who has come into this valley believing that it's full of people too isolated and too polite to fight back." She clicked her pen with a particular precision. "He's always been wrong, and I have always enjoyed helping demonstrate it." Daniel made a sound that might have been a laugh. Victoria looked at William. He looked back at her across the kitchen table, and in that look was everything they hadn't said in 2 weeks of careful, practical, adjacent conversation. All of it present, all of it understood, none of it yet spoken aloud. He looked away first. There was work to do. The work took 3 days. Eleanor coordinated the filings. Ramos and Pearson submitted their interested party documentation on Tuesday. 2 more Valley farmers, once they understood what was in the assessor's records, asked to join the proceeding. By Wednesday afternoon, what had begun as a family estate dispute had formally become a water rights matter with 6 interested parties and a documented pattern of land acquisition that Moore was going to have a very difficult time explaining away as coincidental. William spent those 3 days doing what he was actually useful for, not legal strategy, not document preparation, but the specific work of talking to people. He drove the valley roads he hadn't driven in 4 years, stopped at gates and knocked on doors, talked to men and women who had been watching Caldwell's quiet accumulation of parcels with vague unease and no framework for understanding what they were looking at. He gave them the framework. He showed them the map. He was plain and specific and answered questions directly, and he did not overstate anything, because overstating things was what people did when they wanted to create alarm rather than understanding, and William had no interest in alarm. He wanted understanding. It was Victoria who noticed what was happening to him before he noticed it himself. She called him Wednesday evening after he'd come back up the mountain and was eating the kind of dinner that resulted from opening the refrigerator and making do with whatever was present. "Clara from the feed store called me today," she said. "She said William Cooper came by to talk about the water rights situation. I was in the area. She also said, and these are her exact words, she said, 'I haven't seen William Cooper actually talk to anyone in this town for 4 years. And today, he sat in my office for 45 minutes and explained the whole thing from start to finish and answered every question I had and didn't look once at the door.'" He set down his fork. "Clara talks too much." Clara talked exactly the right amount. A pause. Warm, careful, deliberate. "William, how are you?" The question landed differently than it had the first time she'd tried to ask him. Something like it differently than any version of that question had landed in 4 years. Not as an obligation, not as a social ritual, as genuine curiosity about the interior state of a specific person. "I'm better than I've been," he said. "That's not a small thing to say." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. Victoria." He stopped, started again. "When this is settled, the legal matter Caldwell all of it, I'd like to take you somewhere. Not church, not the hardware store, not either of our kitchens." The line was very quiet for a moment. "Where did you have in mind?" "There's a place on the upper mountain road, where you can see the whole valley from one spot. Sarah." He stopped. The name came out before he'd decided to say it the first time he'd said it to Victoria directly, and the weight of it was real and specific, and not something he was going to pretend wasn't there. "Sarah and I used to go there. I haven't been in 4 years." A beat. "I think it's time I went back. I think I'd like to go with you if you're willing." The silence this time was the kind that breathes. "I'm willing," she said quietly. He picked up his fork again. His hand was steady. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Why? What happens tomorrow?" Caldwell, he said. "He's been quiet for 3 days. That's not patience, that's preparation." He was right. Caldwell made his move on Thursday. Not through Moore. Not through any legal channel. He was apparently smart enough to understand that the legal ground had shifted against him. He made it through the one avenue William hadn't fully anticipated, which was a measure of how strategic the man actually was. He went to Reverend Dawson, not to gather information this time, to make a donation. A substantial one to the church's community outreach fund. The same fund that had always been the most underfunded line in Dawson's budget, the one Dawson had been trying to build for 2 years. The donation came with a letter that was very carefully written to appear both generous and unofficially conditional, full of language about shared vision and community values, and the importance of good relationships between local institutions and responsible developers. Dawson called Victoria that evening. She could hear the discomfort in his voice, the specific discomfort of a man who knows he has already been in the wrong once and is now being asked to go there again from a different direction. "He sent a donation to the church," Dawson said. "A significant one." "I know." She kept her voice even. "What does he want for it?" "The letter doesn't say anything explicitly." "Reverend." She let that sit for a moment. "What does he want?" A pause. "He asked in a conversation we had this afternoon separately. From the letter he asked whether I thought the congregation would benefit from a word about the importance of not letting outside influences disrupt community relationships. Something along those lines. He wants you to preach against me." He didn't frame it that way. He didn't need to. She was quiet for a moment. "Reverend Dawson, I'm going to ask you something I want you to think about honestly before you answer. Is the work I've been doing in this valley, and the work that 32 acres could do for the families here, consistent with what you preach on Sunday mornings. A very long pause. Yes, Dawson said. It is. Then I'd encourage you to decide accordingly. She paused. And return the donation. She called William immediately after. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting the way he always did. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly long enough for her to know he'd absorbed all of it. He's getting desperate, William said. Going to Dawson is a last resort move. It means the legal ground isn't working and he knows it. Or it means he has something else planned and this is misdirection. He went still on his end of the line. That's a good thought. What else could he be doing while we're watching Dawson? William ran it through. Caldwell, stripped of his legal frame and his information source and his social maneuvering, had one significant remaining asset: money. Money could move faster than legal proceedings if applied in the right direction. It could reach creditors directly. It could make debt disappear in ways that made the person whose debt it was feel simultaneously grateful and obligated. Daniel, William said. Victoria's breath caught. He wouldn't. Daniel already told them the sale was off. Caldwell doesn't need the sale now. He needs Daniel to withdraw from the legal proceeding. If Daniel isn't a party to the estate dispute, the quiet title action weakens considerably. William was already thinking through it. He doesn't need to buy the land anymore, Victoria. He just needs to remove enough of the legal structure around it that he can acquire it through another channel later after the attention dies down. The silence on the line was the specific silence of a woman doing rapid, accurate thinking. Daniel's phone, she said. He gave his number to Caldwell's assistant 2 weeks ago when he was still considering the sale. They have it. Call Daniel, right now. Tell him not to accept any calls from numbers he doesn't recognize tonight. William. Call him and then call me back. She called back in 4 minutes. Too late, she said, and her voice had the flat quality of someone reporting damage. Daniel got a call an hour ago. He thought it was from the hospital billing department, same area code. It wasn't. A beat. They offered to purchase his debt outright, all 3 creditors simultaneously. The offer was apparently very specific about amounts and included account numbers that they should only have had if someone had been in contact with the creditors directly. William sat down. He didn't agree to anything. He said he needed to think about it. He didn't say yes. A pause. But William, if someone buys his debt, if Caldwell becomes Daniel's creditor, then Daniel owes money to the man trying to take your mother's land, and the pressure shifts from selling to Daniel to whatever other arrangement Caldwell decides to offer. He was on his feet again. It's clean. It's also illegal depending on how it was arranged. Is it? Debt purchasing is legal. Coordinating it as leverage in a legal proceeding is not. He was moving. I need to call Eleanor. And you need to get Daniel to write down everything he remembers about that call. Exactly what was said, what numbers were mentioned, what time frame they gave him. He's here. I'll tell him now. Victoria. He stopped moving for a moment. Is Daniel all right? A pause. Something shifted in her voice. Gratitude, and underneath it, something that had nothing to do with the current crisis and everything to do with the fact that he'd asked. He's shaken. He feels like he made a mistake taking the call. He didn't make a mistake. He answered his phone. That's not a crime. He paused. Tell him that. I will. I'll be there in 30 minutes. He made it in 22. Eleanor was at the Whitfield house by 9 that evening, and she was the most focused William had ever seen her, which was saying something. She reviewed Daniel's notes on the call. He had written them out in the careful, methodical handwriting of a man who understood he was documenting something important. And she read them twice, and then set them down, and looked at the room with the expression of someone who has just been handed exactly what they needed. The account numbers, she said. They quoted specific account numbers from all 3 creditors. Yes, Daniel said. Those numbers are not public information. They couldn't have obtained them without direct contact with the billing departments. She tapped the page. And if they made contact with the billing departments on the same day that a legal proceeding was active in which Daniel Harrison is a named party, that contact constitutes an attempt to interfere with a party to an active legal matter. The room was very quiet. "That's not a civil issue," William said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "That's a criminal one." Daniel looked between them. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning that Nathan Caldwell has just handed us something considerably more useful than a quiet title proceeding." Eleanor picked up her phone. "I need to make a call." "At 9 o'clock at night?" Daniel asked. "The county attorney and I have been friends for 20 years, Eleanor said, already dialing. "She'll want to know about this tonight." She stepped into the other room. The three of them sat at the kitchen table in the particular silence of people waiting for something to resolve that has been building for longer than any of them wanted. Daniel looked at William. "How did you know he'd go after me?" "Because he'd run out of other options, and you were the softest structural point." William said it without cruelty. "Not because you're weak, because you had the most pressure on you and the least information." "I almost took the call's offer seriously," Daniel said. It cost him something to say it. William could see that. "I know. If I had, you didn't." William looked at him steadily. "That's the whole of it." Daniel nodded slowly, looked at his hands. "I owe you an apology, from 2 weeks ago. What I said about you being a cowboy telling us how land law worked. You didn't know me. I was wrong anyway." William held his gaze. "You're here. That's enough." Across the table, Victoria was watching them both with the careful attention she brought to things she considered important. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Eleanor came back into the kitchen 12 minutes later. "The county attorney is opening a preliminary inquiry," she said. "She'll need Daniel's written account, the phone records showing the incoming number, and whatever documentation the creditors have on whether they were contacted today." She sat down. "She also wants to know if we have any documentation of Caldwell's relationship with Dawson, and whether any of the information Dawson shared can be connected to decisions Caldwell made during the legal proceeding." "I have the dates," Victoria said immediately. "Every conversation I had with Dawson, approximately what I shared, and the subsequent timing of Caldwell's actions." Eleanor looked at her with something that might have been admiration in a less contained woman. "Write it up tonight. Everything you can remember." "I'll help her," William said. Eleanor gathered her legal pad and stood. "I'll be at the county attorney's office at 8 tomorrow morning." She looked around the table. "Get some sleep, all of you. Tomorrow is going to require clear heads." She left. Daniel looked at William and Victoria. "I'm going to the motel," he said. He stood up, then stopped, looked at his sister. "Vic." He paused, and in the pause was everything: the years of distance, the debt he hadn't shared, the sale he'd almost agreed to, the morning he'd finally called the hospital himself. "Mom would have liked him," he said quietly, tilting his head toward William. He left before Victoria had to figure out what to do with her face. She sat with it for a moment. Then she pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at William across it and said very quietly, "She would have you know." He looked back at her. The kitchen was warm, and the hour was late, and outside the cold mountain air was carrying the smell of coming winter, and he was sitting across a table from a woman who had waited 2 years for him without agenda and was now fighting for something real with every tool she had, and he was done, entirely permanently done, pretending that what he felt was anything other than what it was. "Victoria," he said. "I know." She met his eyes. "I know, William. I need to say it." "You don't have to." "I want to." He held her gaze steadily. "I have been in love with you for longer than I knew what to do with it. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. It needed to be said out loud. By me to you directly." He paused. "That's all." She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were still flat on the table. Her eyes were very clear. "I have been in love with you," she said. "Since approximately the 3rd Sunday, I sat across an aisle from a man who studied the floor instead of the congregation, and looked to me like someone who still had a great deal of living left to do and didn't know it yet." He breathed. "That's all," she said with a trace of the almost smile that was the real one. "We should write up those dates for Eleanor." He pulled out a chair and sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, and she pushed the legal pad toward him, and he uncapped a pen, and they worked side by side at her kitchen table until well past midnight. And when they finally finished, the stack of paper in front of them was precise and thorough, and represented everything Caldwell had done, in order with documentation, in the kind of format that a county attorney could use without having to interpret anything. It was good work. He drove back up the mountain with both windows down, the cold air, sharp and clean, and he let himself feel the full weight of everything the evening had contained. The legal turn. Daniel's apology. The thing Victoria had said, with her hands flat on the table and her eyes entirely clear. He was not carrying less than he'd carried before. Sarah was still there. The 4 years were still there. The grief was real and permanent, and part of the structure of who he was. But something had come alongside it. Something that didn't ask him to put down what he was carrying. Something that just walked beside him while he carried it. He pulled up to his ranch house and sat in the truck for a moment before going inside, and he looked at the stars, hard and clear and enormous, the way they only are when you're high enough, and the air is cold enough, and everything unnecessary has been stripped away. And he thought about Victoria saying, "I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd Sunday," and he let the words exist fully, without managing them, or containing them, or building a wall between himself and what they meant. Then he went inside. He passed the counter. Her tin was still there. 2 months, and he still hadn't put it away. He touched the rim of it briefly, just his fingertip, just for a second, and went to bed. And for the first time in 4 years, he slept without waking. Deep and unbroken, the kind of sleep that only comes when something a person has been bracing against finally gives way, when the body understands. Before the mind does, that it is safe to rest. How was up before dawn anyway? Old habit. The ranch didn't care about emotional breakthroughs, but he moved through the morning differently. Not lighter exactly. He wasn't a man who used words like lighter without examining them first, but less burdened in the specific way of someone who has set down a secondary weight they hadn't fully realized they were carrying. The primary weight was still there. It would always be there. Sarah was still the 4th year of his grief, and the 8th day, and the chair beside the bed. Nothing about last night had changed that. What had changed was that he was no longer alone with it. He was feeding the horses when his phone rang at 6:53. Eleanor Page, who apparently kept the same hours he did. The county attorney moved fast, Eleanor said without preamble. She had investigators contact all 3 of Caldwell's creditors by 7 this morning. 2 of them confirmed direct contact from a third-party debt acquisition firm 2 days ago. The firm is registered in Billings. A pause of the specific kind that meant she was choosing her next words with precision. The firm's registered agent is Harlan Moore. William set down the feed bucket. Caldwell's own lawyer, the same man who filed the counter-motion characterizing this as a personal dispute. Eleanor's tone was the judicial equivalent of a blade being sharpened. Moore represented both Caldwell in the legal proceeding and the firm making the debt acquisition offer to Daniel. That is a conflict of interest of a fairly spectacular variety. Can they use that? The county attorney is not using the word can anymore. She's using the word will. Another pause. William Harlan Moore has handled 4 previous Caldwell acquisitions in 3 counties. The county attorney has been aware of Moore's activities for 2 years and has been waiting for something with enough documentation to act on. The precision in Eleanor's voice sharpened further. We just handed her a case. He stood very still in the cold morning air, absorbing the full shape of what Eleanor was telling him. This had never only been about 32 acres of foothills land and a community garden. This had been the visible edge of something considerably larger, and they had pulled on it carefully and with documentation, and now it was coming. "Does Victoria know?" he asked. "You're my first call. She's the second. Call her now. She should hear it from you before it's anywhere else." He picked up the feed bucket again. "And Eleanor, tell her the project is going forward. Whatever else happens, that part is settled. I was going to that, regardless." A brief pause that carried coming from Eleanor Page, the weight of considerable feeling held in very small space. "You did good work, William. We all did. You came off the mountain," she said simply. That mattered most. She hung up. He stood with his phone in his hand for a moment, then finished feeding the horses and went inside to get ready to drive down to Silver Creek. The news moved through town with the particular velocity of information that people have been half expecting and are relieved to finally have confirmed. By 10 in the morning, Margaret Albright had spoken to 9 people. By noon, the diner was full of conversations that lowered in volume when someone new walked in and then resumed the moment the door closed. By 2 in the afternoon, Hector Ramos had called 4 neighboring farmers and organized an impromptu meeting at the co-op grain elevator that Tom Delaney attended and then reported back to anyone who asked. Nathan Caldwell checked out of the motel he'd been staying at on Tuesday morning. His truck was seen heading south toward Billings. He did not say goodbye to anyone because men like Nathan Caldwell did not do goodbyes. They did departures, strategic and clean leaving, nothing behind that could be used as evidence of defeat. He left behind quite a bit of evidence of defeat. Harlan Moore's office in Billings released a statement on Wednesday confirming that Moore was stepping back from the Caldwell representation, pending a review of the firm's involvement in related matters. The language was carefully crafted to say almost nothing and nonetheless managed to confirm everything. The county attorney's preliminary inquiry became a formal investigation within 72 hours of Eleanor's call, which was fast by any standard, and said something specific about the quality of the documentation they'd handed over and the patience that had been waiting behind it. Daniel Harrison, for his part, drove back to Bozeman on Tuesday evening with Eleanor's number saved in his phone and a structured agreement with all 3 creditors that extended his timeline by 14 months and reduced his immediate monthly obligation by a third. He hugged his sister in the driveway of the Whitfield house for a long time before he got in his car. He shook William's hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake strictly required. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "She doesn't need taking care of," William said, "but I'll be here." Daniel looked at him with the direct assessing gaze that he'd apparently inherited from the same place Victoria had gotten hers. "Same thing," he said. "In the language she speaks." He drove away. Victoria stood in the driveway watching until his taillights disappeared. And then she stood there a little longer, and William stood beside her, and didn't say anything, because this was the kind of moment that words made smaller. After a while, she said, "He's going to be all right." "Yes. It's going to take him a while to forgive himself for almost selling it. Give him time. He's his mother's son." She turned to look at him. Something in her face was very open, not vulnerable, not fragile, but the specific openness of someone who has been through a hard thing and come out on the other side of it and can afford finally to be simply present. "You said that before, when he called the hospital himself. It was true then and it's true now." She looked at him for another moment. "William, the mountain road, the place you mentioned." He met her eyes. "Sunday," he said, "after church." The almost smile, the real one. The one that arrived before she could decide whether to allow it. "Sunday," she agreed. The call that neither of them had anticipated came Friday morning. Victoria answered it, and William knew something significant had happened because she called him back within 2 minutes, and her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before. Not alarm, but the specific register of someone receiving news they'd hoped for but hadn't allowed themselves to fully expect. "The court accepted Eleanor's filing," she said. "The quiet title is confirmed. The 32 acres are protected from sale, pending the resolution of the estate proceeding. And Eleanor says the testamentary intent argument is strong enough that she expects the court to rule in our favor within 60 days. A breath. "William, it's going to happen. The project is going to happen." He was quiet for a moment, just to let it be real before he said anything about it. "I know. 60 days. I heard. I have 17 families waiting, and now I have the land. And the letters, Eleanor says the letters will be enough to—" She stopped herself. He could hear her pulling back from the momentum of it, the way she always did when feeling was outrunning language. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't the most articulate—" "Don't apologize for being happy," he said. "You've earned it." A pause that had texture to it. "Come down today," she asked. "I'll be there in an hour." I was there in 45 minutes. She met him at the door, and before he'd finished stepping inside, she had her arms around him. direct, uncalculated, the full genuine weight of it, and he held her back, both hands solid against her back, and they stood in the doorway of the Whitfield house that needed a new roof and probably new floors, and he let himself hold something real, without bracing for the moment it would be taken away. She pulled back after a moment. Her eyes were bright in a way that she didn't try to manage. "I keep thinking about what she would say. My mother." "What do you think she'd say?" She thought about it honestly. She'd say, "I took too long to ask for help." A short, wet laugh. She was very practical. "Must run in the family." She'd also say. She stopped, looked at him with something completely steady. She'd say the land is only as good as the people who tend it. That the point was never the acres. The point was the families. She paused. "And she'd probably say something embarrassing about you that I'm not going to repeat." He looked at her. "Tell me anyway." The real smile, fully, without reservation. She'd say, "That man has good hands and a good heart, and any woman who doesn't see that deserves to be alone." She watched his face. "She said it about my father the first time she saw him fix a fence." How was quiet for a moment. The weight of that, of being seen in that specific way by a woman he'd never met, through the eyes of her daughter, who had sat across an aisle from him for 2 years, settled into him with a permanence that he didn't try to deflect. "She sounds like she was something," he said. "She was everything." Victoria looked at his hands briefly, just for a second. She was right about the hands, for what it's worth. He breathed, looked back at her. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she confirmed. The Sunday that changed Silver Creek didn't look like a significant Sunday from the outside. The weather was cold and clear, the way November weather is when it has decided to be honest about itself. Reverend Dawson had returned Caldwell's donation quietly, without announcement, by mailing a check to the address on the business card, and had spent a week apparently doing the kind of private accounting that a man does when he has to reckon with the distance between what he preaches and what he practices. He had knocked on Victoria's door on Thursday, with no prepared speech, and simply said he was sorry, and she had looked at him for a moment, and said she accepted that, and they had stood in the doorway briefly, and then he had left, and that had been the whole of it. It was enough. William arrived at church 12 minutes early. He sat in his usual pew, third from the back left side, close enough to the door to leave far enough from the front to not be expected to perform. Old habit. Some habits persisted, not because they were necessary, but because they were the last visible trace of a version of yourself that you weren't quite ready to let go of entirely. Victoria came in at 8 minutes before the service. She walked down the aisle past her usual pew and sat down beside him. Not across the aisle. Beside him. He looked at her. She looked forward at the Reverend's empty lectern with the complete focused attention that he had watched from across an aisle for 2 years and had never once been the direct beneficiary of until now. He looked forward too. The man beside him on the other side. Old Pete Garrison, who had farmed the North Corridor for 40 years and whose hearing had been going since the mid-90s, turned and looked at Victoria, and then at William, and then back at Victoria. He said nothing. He simply nodded once, with the slow, comprehensive nod of a man who has been watching a long game and is glad to see it conclude sensibly. William nodded back. The service began. He didn't study the floor crack once. After the service, they drove up the mountain together in his truck. The road narrowed as it climbed, and the valley opened up below them by degrees. First the town, then the farmland, then the full wide reach of Silver Creek Valley, spreading south and east with the late November light moving across it in long, slow sheets that made the whole thing look like something painted rather than real. He pulled off where the road widened at the overlook. They got out without discussing it. He hadn't been here in 4 years. He stood at the edge of the overlook and looked at the valley he had been born in and had lived in his entire life, and had spent 4 years looking at from a distance, while telling himself that distance was the same as safety. Victoria stood beside him, her shoulder 6 inches from his, her face toward the same view. "You came here with her," Victoria said. Not a question. "Yes. Tell me something about her." She said it quietly, without agenda. "Something you haven't said to anyone." He was quiet for a moment, considered whether he was ready. Found that he was in the same way he'd found he was ready to ask her to come here, not without effort, but without question. She was terrible at directions, he said. Completely, almost impressively terrible. She could get lost between the ranch and the highway, which is a single road. She had a compass she carried everywhere that she didn't know how to read. A pause. She thought she did. She was wrong about that consistently and cheerfully. He looked at the valley. We drove in the wrong direction for 40 minutes once on the way to her cousin's wedding because she was reading the compass backwards and insisted she wasn't. He stopped. I've never told that to anyone because it seemed too small, but I think about it sometimes. Victoria didn't say that was a good memory, or a funny memory, or any of the things people say when they're responding to grief. She said, she sounds like someone who moved through the world with a lot of confidence. Yes. He felt the accuracy of it like a physical thing. Yes, that's exactly right. The best people usually do. She was quiet for a moment. I used to get angry when my father was at his worst because he wasn't the person I remembered. I wanted the version of him back. I wanted to skip the part where he was broken. She paused. My mother told me that the broken part was still him. That love wasn't something you offered to the good version of a person and withheld from the rest. She said that was not love. That was preference. He turned to look at her profile. She was still looking at the valley. You've been practicing that with me, he said. I've been believing it about you, she said. There's a difference. Practicing implies effort. What I felt when I sat across that aisle was not effort. He looked at her for a long time. She turned to meet his eyes, and he let her look at him directly, without deflecting, without the careful management of what he allowed to show, and she saw all of it, all of him, the grief and the 4 years, and the thing he was becoming that was different from what he'd been, and she looked at all of it without flinching. He took her hand. She held it. They stood at the edge of the overlook, with the valley spread below them, and the cold air moving through, and he felt the weight of what he was carrying, and the warmth of the hand in his, and understood finally and completely that these two things were not opposites. They had never been opposites. He had made them opposites by telling himself that grief had to be finished before living could resume, and that was the lie he had been living inside for 4 years, and it was done. Victoria, yes. I don't know how to do this without being a person who's still carrying something. I know. Her hand was steady in his. I'm not asking you to put it down. I never was. I know you weren't. He looked at her directly. I'm telling you I'm going to try anyway, not to put it down, to carry it differently, with you alongside. She turned to face him fully. The cold air was between them, and the whole valley was behind her, and her eyes were clear and entirely present, and she said, William Cooper, I sat in a church pew across an aisle from you for 2 years, without being asked to, and without being thanked for it, and without expecting anything in return. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes. Then stop explaining yourself and be here. He laughed, the same surprised, genuine laugh that she had drawn out of him on her porch that first evening. The one that sounded like a word in a language he'd been afraid he'd forgotten. She was smiling. The real one. Both of them at the edge of a mountain, overlook in November, laughing and steady, and exactly where they were supposed to be. He kissed her, brief, certain. The way a man kisses a woman when he has thought about it for a long time and has finally run out of reasons not to. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything. No performance, no hesitation. Just the honest present fact of it. When he pulled back, she was still looking at him with those clear, steady eyes. Sunday, she said quietly. Every Sunday, he said. The community project broke ground in the spring. 17 families showed up on the first day, which was a Saturday in late April, when the ground had thawed enough to work, and the light was the particular quality of light that comes with a season that has finally kept its promise. Eleanor Page was there in boots that had seen more fieldwork than most people assumed. Tom Delaney brought his truck loaded with materials donated by every supplier in the valley who had been asked, and not a single one who had refused. Hector Ramos drove a tractor up from his farm and spent 4 hours breaking the east section of ground without being asked. Margaret Albright, to nearly everyone's surprise, showed up with food for 30 people and an uncharacteristic willingness to be useful without commentary. Daniel Harrison drove from Bozeman with his wife, who had heard the story in stages over several months, and arrived with the quality of someone who has been waiting to meet the people her husband has been describing and finds them exactly as advertised. She shook Victoria's hand and said, "My mother-in-law's letters were beautiful. I read them before the filing." She paused. She loved this land. She loved what it could do, Victoria said. "There's a difference." Daniel's wife looked at her and nodded slowly, with the nod of someone filing something important. William worked the whole day alongside Ramos and the other farmers, and he said less than most people and did more than all of them, and nobody commented on this because it was understood. He had spent 4 years being a man who lived on a mountain and kept his distance, and the people of Silver Creek were not the kind of people who made a production of watching someone return to themselves. They just made room. Near the end of the afternoon, when the first framing stakes were in the ground and the lines of what would become the covered growing spaces were marked clearly in the broken earth, Victoria found him at the edge of the property line, looking at the creek that ran along the boundary. She stood beside him. "Miller Creek," she said. "Running fine," he said. "Like it always has." She looked at the water for a moment. "My mother used to say water always finds its way, that you could redirect it, slow it down, try to contain it, but eventually it found the path it was meant for." Your mother was wise. She was practical. The familiar dry note. Same thing in her language. He looked at her. The afternoon light was doing something specific to her face that he didn't try to describe even to himself, because some things were not improved by description. She was present and real, and standing beside him at the edge of a creek on a piece of land that had been fought for and won, and she was here, and so was he. "I went back to the church floor crack this morning," he said. She turned. "The one you used to study. It's still there." He looked at the water. "I noticed I wasn't looking at it the way I used to. I was just looking at it because it was there, not because I needed somewhere else to look." She understood exactly what he meant. He knew she did, because she didn't ask him to explain it. "Good," she said simply. He took her hand, the way he'd taken it at the Overlook. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just the honest, simple fact of his hand finding hers, because that was where it belonged. She held on, behind them, the sound of 17 families working the land that had been meant for them. Children's voices, the knock of tools. Ramos calling something across the field, in a voice that carried no question of who was listening, rose into the April air and mixed with the sound of Miller Creek running clean and unimpeded where it had always run. And Reverend Dawson, who had come quietly and worked quietly all day without making anything of his presence, stopped near the end of the afternoon beside Eleanor Page, and looked at William and Victoria standing at the creek and said in the voice he used for things he believed, "That took patience." Eleanor looked at them too. "It took 2 years," she said. "Some things need 2 years. Some people need someone who understands that." Eleanor tucked her legal pad under her arm and watched for another moment. The lucky ones find them. The investigation into Nathan Caldwell's land acquisition practices took 14 months to complete. It named 8 properties across 3 counties, established a pattern of coordinated debt acquisition used as legal leverage, and resulted in findings that were referred to the State Attorney General's office. Harlan Moore surrendered his law license in a negotiated agreement. Nathan Caldwell reached a settlement that required the divestiture of 3 of the 8 parcels at independently appraised market value, with the proceeds placed in a Valley Land Trust administered by, among others, Eleanor Page and Hector Ramos. None of this happened quickly. Real justice rarely does. But it happened. The court confirmed the testamentary intent ruling on the Harrison estate property in 63 days, exactly as Eleanor had predicted. The 32 acres became the legal foundation of the Silver Creek Community Growing and Learning Center, which opened its covered growing spaces the following October and served 41 families in its first season. William built the main potting bench himself. Solid wood level and true-sized for working rather than for looking at. Victoria ran her hand along it the morning it was installed and said it was the most useful thing anyone had ever built for her. He said he intended to keep trying. She said she intended to let him. On the first Sunday of December, 2 years and 3 months after Victoria Harrison had first settled into the third pew from the back of Silver Creek Church, with her worn leather journal and her unhurried quality of attention, William Cooper crossed the aisle before the service began and sat down beside her. He brought nothing with him but himself. No hat in his hands, no floor crack to study, no careful management of how much of him he allowed to be visible. He sat down beside the woman who had seen him before he was ready to be seen, and had waited anyway, and he opened the hymnal to the right page without being shown. And when the choir began, and her voice rose low and rough and entirely genuine, he added his own unpracticed and honest into the same space. Neither of them performed anything. They were simply there. And that was the whole and complete truth of it. William Cooper had loved and lost, had broken and endured, had spent 4 years on a mountain, convincing himself that finished was the same as ended. And then a woman with a worn journal and a patience he hadn't earned had sat across an aisle from him and refused to agree. She had been right. He had been worth finding. And every Sunday morning after that, in the third pew, from the back of Silver Creek Church in the valley, where Miller Creek still ran clean, and the community garden grew in every season that the ground allowed, the mountain cowboy who forgot how to hope sat beside the woman who never forgot why it mattered, and that was not an ending. That was everything that comes after one.